Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage, Errant, Book 7, The Last Echo of the Lord of Bells, chapters 43 through 46. Just a Weapon. To the Victors. Emergent Effects and Teleporter Fight! Exclamation point. In these chapters, yes indeed, we do get a teleporter fight. But mostly, we get to check in with our friends and see some of the side battling that's going on. We don't check back in with Alustin, which I was a little sad about. And I have some questions about this hidden clan that doesn't seem as exclusive as anybody seems to think it is. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode, for being patient when I'm late all the time, and for being patient when I'm over here just saying the wrong chapters to start off with and having to begin my intro all over again. Appreciate you, Dan. So let's just start from the beginning, shall we? Because you know I have to talk about that hidden clan thing, but I'm going to wait until we actually get there. So chapter 43, Just a Weapon. From the title, you already know that this is going to be a conversation with Talia about what she's been going through internally since finding out the truth about why she was kept away from other bone mages. And it's a funny thing because, it's mentioned by her when we're in her head. She felt silly for not asking more questions about that she should have known what was going on because all the clues were there. And, I kind of feel like that's the author also telling the reader that, we should have known. But I'm going to be honest, I can never keep the principles of a certain type of magic in my head enough to be able to do the kind of critical thinking that would be necessary to realize the truth about her whole deal. I know that there is a point where another bone mage specifically says to her, "What do you mean the thing Alustin warned you about isn't even possible? That's not how things work." But that was just earlier this book. And there are times when something like that would make me really focus on it and ask a lot more questions. But it would be in the middle of the series. That it would not be right at the end. At the last book, we're starting to get into a battle, series of chapters. I was not taking the time there to stop and be like, what's that about? With any real focus. It was just a sort of general, I'm going to acknowledge that this is a question that's come up, but I don't have time to worry about it right now. And I'm sure that before long we're getting an answer because there's only so many chapters left. So, and I'm just really, really curious because I have that disconnect, I guess you could say, with the focus on a magical system that I don't particularly get that invested. I want a magical system to make sense and be internally consistent. And that's pretty much all I ask. It doesn't need to be that complicated. I'm wondering how many people out there who were listening were able to or I'm saying listening, everybody's listening to the audiobook. Whoever was reading this book, were you able to put two and two together before this and kind of be well, based on the rules that we were told, that actually doesn't make sense? I'm just really curious about that because I really enjoy finding out how other people's minds work. It's startling sometimes because I just get into the same kind of headspace I think a lot of us do, where I assume that the way I see things is the way almost everybody sees things. And I am constantly reminded, especially while doing this show, that everybody out there does not have the same types of interests in the parts of fiction that I care about. And so I'll get comments, questions, things like that from listeners bringing up things that they were really wishing I touched on in my discussion that I never did because it just wasn't a priority for me. And they were like, I was listening specifically for the reaction to this and you didn't even mention it. And I'm like, I'm sorry. Dan says, I doubt anyone figured this out. It really wasn't that obvious. Okay, I didn't think it was. And obviously it's going to feel to Talia like, oh, it was so obvious, but this is her magic and it's something that she's been so focused on. So of course for her, it's going to be especially galling because she spent so much time mulling over all of this stuff. So Talia here, Dan says, I held out that a character was still alive in the Wheel of Time for 15 years in a debate with my brother. I was right, too. This is the sort, like, and I always wonder about this, because I have gotten back into writing this little murder mystery that I've been wanting to work on for a while. And NaNoWriMo has happened, and I've finally kind of gotten my act together with getting more in the habit. And I have decided to kind of stop doing the thing that I was initially trying, which was to plan everything out in advance and just fucking write and come to terms with the fact that I will be doing extensive editing. Things will change. I will move stuff around. I will take things out. And I just have to accept that I'm not writing a perfect first draft. Like that's not how it should work. But the idea of like a character that you're like, oh, they're still alive. I bet they're still alive. And I always wonder, now, were they really still alive? Or did the author just one day be like, you know what? I think I want to make him still alive. Like, did the author plan it? Or was it the sort of thing that they kind of had in their back pocket, like, well, if I run out of ideas, I can always bring this person back. You know what I mean? And I'm sure it goes like all over the map, depending on the writer. So Alustin is, you know, the effect he's had on her is kind of like chipped away at her sense of self a little bit. And she says something about how, like, I didn't know how big a weapon I really was. And I guess that's, you know, what a fool Alustin was for throwing me away. And Hugh is like, hey, so listen, about this whole I'm a weapon thing. It's really clear you don't like it. Like, every time you say it, you sound kind of sad. And there's a sense of, like, almost helplessness to it, as if you don't get a choice in whether or not you're a weapon. And the thing is, weapons are objects that are used by people who are making a choice. You aren't being used by anybody. You have choice. And you don't have to be a weapon if that isn't what you want. It's actually up to you. And she says, I'm not a weapon. I'm a warrior. I like that. Well, then I suppose I choose to destroy for myself, not for someone else. That hadn't exactly been the point he was trying to make, but it had Talia smiling again, so he decided not to press his luck. I appreciate that later on, Talia is kind of like, I wish I had just like had a real conversation with him about this, because I gave him a joke response. And really, I am still struggling with this. And I kind of, you know, acted like I was closing the topic, and I shouldn't have. And I have been there a number of times myself. It's not easy sometimes to have the conversations about stuff that's really, really close to home. And they're like still in the midst of a battle. So it truly, I can understand deciding now's not the time to get real vulnerable, you know? Sorry, Dan says, in the Wheel of Time case, it was a plan. Robert Jordan was a crazy person when it came to planning, though. A lot of authors, you can tell long-time twists are unplanned. Cough, Deathly Hallows, cough. Yeah, Deathly Hallows is it's such a shame, you guys. Like, there is something very satisfying and cohesive about, like, the first 4 Harry Potter books. And then things really start to kind of be like, girl, are you, like, just... I don't know if it was the speed at which she had to write. I don't know what the deal was, but once like, once I read Cursed Child, I started to be like, did she even write these books? Like, what the fuck? I don't know how many of you out there have read Cursed Child, but let me tell you, it is cursed in every sense. I've heard people who saw it on stage really thought it was like a great show, but from every account, it's just sort of, oh, the special effects are really good, which is not enough for me. The story is so garbage. Anyway, this is not a bash Harry Potter podcast. So we go then to Sabe's POV, and she is sort of like, she has her focus being pulled in a couple of different directions. One, Sabe, or Talia, who she cares about and is like wondering how she's doing with everything that has been revealed. And the second, it says her usual after-battle considerations, attempting to figure out what they could have done differently, trying to stop Alustin and reclaim the Tongue Eater. The only thing she could think of was cutting short their conversation, but they'd needed to try. Stopping the Tongue Eater would be infinitely easier with Alustin on board, especially since they didn't know how to activate it. Which brought her to the third major consideration, Alustin's claims about the blast radius of the Tongue Eater when it was detonated. And this is exactly the question I was also asking, and Sabe basically comes down on, look, I don't have the information necessary to know whether or not he is in the right. But if there's anybody that I think would have the information necessary to know, it's Kandaron. And Kandaron does not think that Alustin is right about this. So I am just going to go ahead and like take her word for it that this threat is as real as she says, because she knows enough. But the whole thing is just sort of like, it really feels strange, because either Alustin didn't do his homework on this, or he misunderstood the magic, which isn't like him, or he was misinformed himself. And here's my question. Alustin telling Talia how he could have used her, the way that he could have like basically sharpened her to a point and made her a weapon against Havath specifically by letting her friends die, by whatever, and then doing something that would like put her on a suicide path. Did someone do that to Alustin? Because it's starting to feel like he has been manipulated and isn't even aware. Like, we know he was sent that note about how Kandaron is in league with, other interdimensional forces and whatever. And as far as I can recall, Alustin has never even asked the question, where did that note come from? Who sent that? What was their motivation? Like, he asked the question very, very early when we first find out that this note is a factor. But since then, it's not like weighing on his mind. He isn't going, well, what could somebody have gotten out of it telling me this? And it's sort of surprising to me, I guess, like that he isn't asking, because I feel like that seems to be how his mind works. So I'm sort of like, is he being purposely kind of like mentally befuddled by somebody so that he doesn't see clearly? And then the fact that he's operating here with like, oh, this is how the Tongue Eater is going to work, but he seems to really misunderstand. It's like Talia with her being told, oh, this is, how your bone magic works and you can't do such and such. It feels like he was told something by somebody that is fundamentally incorrect, and he really, really believes and trusts that source of information. But we are in his point of view, and we never get a hint of who he spoke to or where he got his information from. And when we go into his POV, even after he tells them, like, you guys are wrong about how this is going to work, he is so distracted by his, like, situation with Valia and the students that have bonded with one another and pacted, that he doesn't spare a thought really for the tongue eater, like, and whether or not he's correct, because I think it's a foregone conclusion to him that he is correct about this. So it feels pretty natural to me that he wouldn't think about it, because you don't spend lots of time mulling over things that are simply an accepted fact. It's the nature of, you just take it at face value and your thoughts are spent on something that is less certain. So my question remains, is Alustin a weapon himself that has been somehow managed and manipulated by somebody else, that either we have met and simply don't know that's what's going on with him, that we haven't met and they are going to turn out to be kind of a surprise, or that is somebody we've met and heard of but isn't a big player so far. Like they're maybe one of the interdimensional beings with the liar or somebody. They seem to be on Kandaron's side, but then there are those other guys that they were up against, the counselors. Was that their name? I hope it's not anything to do with them, I'll be honest, because they are so not part of the story for the most part, that it would give me a kind of a Deathly Hallows vibe of just pulling something out at the last second. But I don't know that this is even that important. It's just a question that I keep coming back to, because ultimately where you get your information from is one of the most telling and important things about how you see and understand the world. And the fact that Alustin is explaining to Talia exactly how he would have handled her in order to make her do what he wanted her to, it feels like a hint, but I don't know if that's just a coincidence or not. Dan says you do get an answer to that note in this book. I figured I would. Yeah. So she goes over to Hugh and Talia and, let's see. Talia, I'll be fine. I'll try not to explode and level any cities today. Not much of a city left for you to level, Godric said. So they call Mackerel back, and Sabe, Hugh shares with them all for the first time that Mackerel had been about to die, and they're all very relieved that he's okay. But it turns out that because Mackerel's, his tracking of Alustin had depended on Alustin having that labyrinth stone, the fact that he no longer has that means that they're not going to be able to zero in on him the way that they were, which was really, really specific. And there's just going to be a lot less certainty about finding him now. So they wind up going to the last place that he was seen, which is really not ideal, especially as things go on. We've got the Eye of Heliothrax forming above the city. Things are really beginning to heat up in the most literal way possible. I love Godric telling them all that he killed the Mud King. Talia immediately raised her hand to high five Godric, and Sabe just sighed and turned back to Hugh. He can track him intermittently. The big labyrinth seems to be leaking its influence somehow, and whenever Alustin passes through one of those zones, Mackerel can track him. Oh no, if his labyrinth stone is gone and we can only track him inside the leaking labyrinth influence, that means others can track him outside those zones, Godric finished. We can't delay any longer. We need to go after him now, Sabe said, before someone else tracks him down or some other new problem rears its head. Hugh gave her a sheepish look. Sabe groaned. There's a new problem, isn't there? Hugh nodded. The labyrinth eruption broke the Dominion's seals and opened the labyrinth entrances. There are a ton of monsters and prisoners pouring out of the labyrinth into the city right now. They're mostly in the city center, but they're spreading out quickly, and at least a few look like great powers. Sabe rubbed at her temples. All right, track down Alustin, reclaim the Tongue Eater, and figure out a way to stop its destruction, all while avoiding Alustin's forces, the Dominion, our own great power allies, and a legion of escaped monsters, unless there are any other complications we need to know about. Hugh awkwardly started to rub at the back of his head, and Sabe closed her eyes and made a noise like a tea kettle. What now? Mackerel just spotted a Seekin elder carrying a small army into the edges of the risen labyrinth. Sabe started to complain, only to have Talia cover her mouth with both hands and glare into her eyes. Stop tempting fate. You keep it up, someone else is going to invade or set off a magical superweapon or something like that. This is exactly Rashawn's vibe. Rashawn is a big believer in the jinx. Like, not the person. I do not know about the person, so I can't make a joke, but I know that he is a person. But the concept of, like, don't say something's going to go well. Don't say, oh, it looks like that's the last problem we had to deal with. Don't say, I guess now we have nothing to worry about. Nothing like that. As soon as you utter those words, she basically looks at you like you spat in her face. Like, it's a look of annoyance and, like, personal disappointment. Like, she really let her down. And I just always start to say, like, I've been trained so well by her that I have learned to mostly keep that inside, but occasionally I will still slip and say some shit, and she's just like, God damn it, Natasha, shut up. So then we go to Heliothrix, who is apparently, like, able to feel the terror of the dragons that she has bound to her, and is just trying to, like, not feel it, which just seems to me like a recipe for eventual madness. And I hope it takes her over and kills her. I hope that this is her getting hoisted on her own petard eventually. We'll see. If she'd had more time, she could have muted their mental voices further, closed off their access to her, but she needed them alive and still sapient to use and control their magics. Though she knew they wouldn't understand, their sacrifice was a noble one. Heliothrix was the protector of Ithos, the symbol of stability for the whole continent. She could not be seen to be defeated, lest the rabble of great powers grow restive and begin to push at the bounds of conduct she alone guaranteed. The coven had to fall, followed by that greedy little wormling Andisthune. Not for Heliothrix's own sake, and certainly not for her pride, for the sake of all the lesser peoples of Ithos. And so she's like, all right, well, I guess I better lay the smack down. And she begins to get the eye of Heliothrix up and running. This was so, like, anytime somebody is like, your sacrifice is not in vain, I cannot tell you guys how sickened I am whenever somebody else uses the word sacrificed about a person who did something unwillingly. Like, unless these dragons all came to Heliothrix and were like, please, please bind me in eternal torment for your own power, they weren't signing up for this. And you can't call it a sacrifice. It's just such a gross misuse of language, and it happens all the time. And a sacrifice implies you chose to give something up for a greater cause, not that somebody else chose to take something from you for their own cause. Very different scenario. So this is when we go to chapter 44, Leon of Clan Castus, and we find out that he is part of the hidden clan. And this is so weird. You guys, I don't know if I'm reading this right. I don't know if this is a joke I should have gotten already, or if I like, everybody is basically thinking they're the only member of Clan Castus that's in the hidden clan, because it's kept so secret, like the membership, that they are feeling really, really proud of themselves, and like told that there is a particular exception in the type of personality they have that makes them better suited to being in this secret clan than other members of their family. And there's this, like, I kept sort of being like, they think they're the most recent member, or like the only one to have been asked to join. And I was sort of just like skating by it, like, that's I thought that so-and-so said it, but I was sort of thinking I must have misunderstood. You know what I mean? Like, I wasn't getting what it was he was trying to say, which was all of them are deluded. And it wasn't until this chapter that I was like, hold on a second. Isn't this like the fourth or third member we've heard thinking something like this? It took me so long, y'all. MX Shard says, I love that they all think they're the only Cassis member in Hidden Clan. It got funnier every time I read it. Dan says, it took me like 3 of these interludes to get this joke. That makes me feel better. Okay, good. So the instant he'd been judged old enough and dangerous by the clan elders, he simply took every single mission he could. He went on every raid he was allowed, hired himself out as a mercenary to all the nearby clans, even hired on as a guard for mages searching the mountains for rare alpine herbs and other alchemical reagents. It was rare he stayed more than a night or two at Hold Castus in a row. He still wasn't exactly sure how he'd ended up getting married, as seldom as he'd been home those years. It had just kind of happened. But then, while many people saw Helga as a kind, sweet woman, Leon knows she had a ruthless streak wider than she was tall. And when she decided she'd wanted Leon, he suspected he hadn't had much choice in the matter. Not that he was complaining, of course. And I don't think has Helga ever been mentioned? This is like, is this a secret marriage, or is it just something that we haven't heard about? So let's see, which was exactly what had led Rana of Clan Darum to recruit him into the Hidden Clan. According to her, members of Clan Castus were constitutionally unsuited for membership in a covert organization. They were entirely too flamboyant, ridiculous, and attention-seeking. So I love this. It's what she's doing is basically, you're not like all of them. You can keep a secret. You're just different, you know? Like, they don't get it. They're not as focused and serious, but you are just a really rare breed amongst your family, and that makes you important and special, and thus you're going to be able to do, and it's like fucking completely working. It's such an underhanded, basic, almost insulting method of doing things, and yet I cannot argue with the results. So, you know, she's very good. She's very, very good. He'd accomplished dozens of missions for the Hidden Clan while also serving Clan Castus. He'd carried out assassinations, hostage rescues, even scouting missions for the Hidden Clan. When he'd robbed Skyhold's library for his family, he hadn't just seized books of fire magic for them, but picked up a long list of titles for the Hidden Clan as well. If the Hidden Clan had a more effective agent, Leon would eat one of his brother Graham's hats. And I'm like, look, sir, I'm not out here keeping score. I'm just saying that maybe you want to cool your jets a little bit. So far as anyone else knew, he was hunting Havathi archmages, which he was in fact doing, and took down 2 of them. His mission from Rana was to hunt another archmage. The only difference was that it was one of their archmages, the Maze Maker. Real name unknown, age unknown, birthplace likely somewhere in the southwestern Ithos, wielded vine and illusion magic to create deadly mazes to entrap his foes. A powerful ally or enemy, and one they could ill afford to sacrifice, but one they could even less afford to let live. He had, after all, stolen from the Hidden Clan. It was unlikely the Maze Maker knew what he'd done, or even of the existence of the Hidden Clan. But on the way to the Coven's meeting at the demesne of Petus the Younger, the Maze Maker had robbed a mid-sized local vault. He'd done it in broad daylight, too, using his vines to conceal himself and crawling along into the vault when it was open for a deposit without ever touching the enchanted walls, floor, and ceiling. Odds were that he hadn't had a chance to sort through everything he'd stolen. Leon didn't know what was in the documents the Maze Maker had stolen or how the Hidden Clan knew he was the culprit. He didn't have to know, though. He had a mission, and he trusted Rana. So, you guys, I know that this is totally weird, but I'm like, should I suspect Rana? I don't know, ultimately everybody thinks they're like the only members. How much do any of them know about what it is they're ultimately being sent to do and how they're being used? Like, this all, there's just something about this. I just think that Rana isn't like the ultimate person. I think maybe she has been put in charge of a thing because she's clearly extremely competent. But, I don't know. I still fucking feel like Alinea. I still am, like, hung up on her. I don't know. Anyway, okay. So he can just pull and push heat. He brushed past the maze maker, and the maze maker died. It wasn't a flashy, showy death. He simply collapsed to the ground dead as Leo drained the heat from his blood and dumped it into his brain. Enough to instantly throw his body into hypothermia and his brain into hyperthermia. Death by nigh instantaneous seizure and shock. That is so scary. You guys. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I ran into, right before I recorded, I ran into the woman who adopted Sam, my other dog that I had to rehome. And you hear me calling him my dog. I mean, what else am I going to say, though? But she, in the course of the conversation, mentioned that she has also been caring for her son, who can squat 800 pounds. But he was just like joking around, grappling with somebody, and he did something weird and basically like completely shifted all of these tendons the wrong way, and his kneecap was up in his thigh, and he had to get surgery. And it was just one of those things that, like, you would think that being in good shape, that your body is a bit more resilient, but our bodies are just, it's weird. We can be so resilient with certain things, and then there can be the tiniest little wrench thrown in the works, and all our shit is completely fucked. And it's bizarre how combination tough and delicate we are. And there's something very humbling about that, you know? You could break literally every bone in your body and ultimately wind up okay. But there's a tiny, teeny little clot in a vein, and that's going to kill you. You know, it's just wild. And so this, like, oh, I'm just going to take heat and just move it, and that instantaneously kills you. That is so terrifying to me. That's, like, I really, really do not care for it. There are certain types of power in this universe that are just too much. They're too much. They're too much power, and I don't like them. You know what I'm saying? They're just... I don't need to know there's anybody in this universe that can do some of the things that they can do. And here goes somebody that's like technically on our side, but he's working for the hidden clan, and like, does he know why? Does he know what he's doing? And he's just out here, yeah, I'll kill that guy because he stole. You don't even know what he stole. You don't know anything. And you're just out here fucking like doing it? Don't you want to know? I could never. This is ultimately what it comes down to, is like, for these organizations to work, you need to be somebody who's willing to take orders and just accept that you have blood on your hands for good reasons because you trust the people giving you the order. And I have never trusted anybody that much in my life, ever. There has never been a point where I haven't like double checked what I've been told to do by somebody, even though I have like more respect for authority than I probably should. I also can understand how incompetent ultimately a lot of people are, and just cover my own ass. So the idea of just being like, yeah, let me just kill this guy real quick, and he doesn't even really know what, you know, just straight up, well, I trust Rana, couldn't be me, I guess. So this is when he starts to feel a like reaction with his tattoo, because it reacts to strange forms of flame. And I believe that it's supposed to be that this is like reacting to the Eye of Heliothrax. Let's see, I'm trying to find the spot here. How much would it annoy his family if he killed a great power on his own? Before Leon even gave himself a chance to think over the plan, a half-dozen dagger-thin flames lances tore through the cloud of phosphorus smoke. As the cloud and its burning nucleus turned back toward the crumbling buildings and falling debris, Leon smiled and began to whistle. Off key, of course, because there's this ongoing thing where he has like the title of most annoying in the clan, which is for some reason a title at all. I mean, if you're going to be Clan Castus, I suppose you just have to do things like this. Like, it's just a requirement that you have really questionable superlatives that people shoot for. But I just can't. And it seems like this moment here where he just shoots those beams up has killed the great power. Like, he takes it very much for granted. Oh yeah, she's done now. Like, she's dead. And whistles and saunters off because he has done the thing. I can't tell whether or not he was correct in that. I think that he must be, because he seems to be good enough at what he does that he can sense this sort of thing. But I honestly, we're in his POV, and he is going to think he's good enough at a sort of thing. Can I trust his point of view? Inherently not, because he thinks he's the only member of the hidden clan from Clan Castus. So I don't know that that's true. I'm not sure. So I love this. But then we go to Karna Scythe, who's in the midst of like making a huge statue of herself for their enemies to have, which I'm just, I enjoy the attitude behind this, but all I can think is that it's like leaving something for a person to draw a mustache on. Like, why would you do this? Just don't bother. So let's see. She looked for something that might explain her sudden agitation. They all seemed jubilant, more focused on their victory than anything. All save the librarian's Errant, one of whom was speaking urgently to Alustin, second in command. He turned, met her gaze, and his voice slipped into her ears. It's the Eye of Heliothrax. We have maybe a minute or two before it hits full strength. So she orders cloud cover. We're marching under cover of the labyrinth unless you want to get melted. And everybody begins to obey orders. Karna used her own magic to lift great clouds of stone dust into the air above their path back to the labyrinth, so they wouldn't be marching over burning hot stone. Around them, the broken ruins of Havath City began to glow in the heat of the sun, waves of heat rippling off the marble and bronze. As her army, oh my god, I can't talk. As her army marched desperately back into the city they'd just destroyed, Karna Scythe spared only a single glance at the statue she'd begun carving in her own image. She swore, then and there, that she was going to end Heliothrax today. Then come back and finish her statue. You know what? Go for it. Go for it, girl. I want somebody to end Heliothrax, so go ahead. If it's you, that's fine. I'm not going to be picky about it. So this is when we go to Indris and Ilinia. And Indris is like, all right, look, let's get real here. We are not going to be able to beat Heliothrax. Like, teamed up, we could have taken old Heliothrax, but there is no goddamn way it is happening now that she has done what she's done to herself. Like, it's just fucking off the table. So we are going to have to find another way to do things. I know that we both have some tricks, but it's time for us to stop hiding things from each other. So let's talk about your little project with Clan Castus. And Ilinia is so annoyed and is just like, I can't believe you know about that. At that, Ilinia stopped hiding and announced her location with a web of lightning thicker than any Indris had ever seen. The web smashed Heliothrax out of the air and into a tangle of labyrinth corridors, pinning her there. Getting to be a great power was a brutal uphill struggle. Staying a great power was even worse. If you didn't keep improving, didn't keep growing in strength and finding new tricks, someone was going to find a way to unseat you. And few great powers were better at finding new tricks than the Kaendas family. They were the longest-lived dynasty of great power on the continent, a continuous chain running from mother to daughter to granddaughter and on. And over those centuries, they'd acquired innumerable enchanted trinkets, exotic spell designs, and other esoterica. The only reason you couldn't call them hoarders was their willingness to use and use up their tricks when they needed to. And this one was something else. Clan Castus was going to be attracting a dangerous amount of attention in the years to come. Since the battle at Skyhold, they'd thrown themselves onto the world stage, announced themselves as a power to be watched. Through the winds, Indris could feel a half dozen of their fire elementals hunting their foes through the ruins of Havath City, flying freely through the rays of sun that could melt flesh, stone, or metal. Those that focused primarily on that raw combat power were missing Castus's real danger, though. Their tattoos. Magic tattoos were common to the point of mundanity among mages, but most were just a simple spell form, a cantrip or glyph linked into flesh that mages could cast without needing their mind's eye. Clan Castus tattoos did more, pushed to the very limits of a stodgy, old-fashioned art, and Elinia had struck a bargain. One that Indris, even with all her spies close to her rival and ally, had barely managed to discover. Though what had truly given it away had been the smell. Dragons didn't have the keenest sense of smell, but their noses were still far more sensitive than human or phoenixes. She'd smelled the ink on Elinia and noted her shifting uncomfortably as the tattoos had healed. She wasn't sure precisely what the spell form Clan Castus had tattooed on Elinia did, besides enhancing her lightning magic, but it was working. So, we have Indris being like, oh, I have this trick, buy me some time. And she just does something that's like, it looks like it's her trick, but it doesn't really have much of an effect. And Heliathrax is like, is that it? Really? And even Elinia is going, dude, are you serious? This was it? And Indris says, oh, guys, I know that you are super into magic, and that's valid. But that's not the only kind of power there is. It's not even really the biggest one. And Heliathrax is like, what? And Indris says, money. Before Heliathrax could respond, a streak of flames, feathers, and talons rammed into the draconic abomination, sending her crashing into another corridor, though she regained her balance a moment later. Elinia laughed in delight as the mercenary phoenix great power Sarkis Vi recovered from his dive and joined the two storm queens circling Heliathrax. That's the problem with mercenaries, isn't it? Their loyalty is to the highest bidder. And Indris just offered me far more than Havath was willing to pay, Sarkis Vi said in a voice like a roaring forest fire. Heliathrax screamed in rage, and around them the rays of sunlight grew brighter. Dun, dun, dun! So, this is when we go to chapter 45. We're in Talia's head at this point. And I'm trying to find the spot here. Talia took a moment to look over these creatures. They were almost insectoid, albeit with asymmetrical body plans. Their right sides were bulkier and with more legs than the left. They almost looked like the wingless children of wasps and locusts, each the size of a boar. And they reeked. The flesh was hot enough to char wood on contact. Her dream fire had proven useless against them, as had her burning winds. The nails were working fine, though. It didn't really matter what temperature metal was if it was moving fast enough. And I was like, yeah, I guess that's true. So they're handling this, holding them off. They thankfully only faced the edge of the swarm. The air in the center was hot enough that debris was catching fire as the creatures climbed over it. Mackerel had been especially squeamish about closing with the creatures. Even though he wasn't made of paper, he sometimes still acted skittish around flames. Of course, other times, Talia had seen the spellbook actually playing in fire, so she assumed he was just being his usual weird self. So this is when they say that they're going to find Alustin at his last known location. There were ever-growing numbers of monsters streaming from the labyrinth. And, of course, the heat is also getting worse throughout all of this. So there's just the mention of, trying to find cover, things beginning to melt and steam, and just the sense of, urgency about everything. Let's see. Here's the part. Talia turned her attention away from her maelstrom of thoughts with a little help from what lay in front of them. A waterfall. This one, not of dust and debris like they'd been passing before. This was a magma fall. Molten bronze and marble seethed together, half mixing, half clinging, like oil and water to one another as it descended from the heights above. It wasn't particularly impressive, no more than a trickle that dissolved into droplets now and then, but even as Talia watched, that trickle became a rivulet with the promise of brooks and streams to come. "How much debris do you think is up there?" Godric asked uncomfortably. "Too much," Sabe said. "More and more problems just keep cropping up." "Emergent effects," Hugh muttered. "Every time mages fight, there are unpredictable emergent effects, but they're usually on a barely noticeable scale. When great powers fight, they not only get noticeable, they can become a bigger deal than the sum of the spells producing them. And we're dealing with more great powers fighting in one spot than I have ever even heard of, along with multiple magical superweapons. This isn't going to be the last or even probably the biggest effect." And Talia, being as practical as she is, goes, "Well, okay, whatever. This is the effect that we're dealing with right now, though. So let's get, we'll figure this out and deal with the other shit later." And this is when somebody yells out, "Well, this isn't the only problem you have." And they turn and see a finely dressed man holding a half-full wine glass. And it's Matin Koss, the spatial mage. And, of course, the way he said that, everybody interprets this as like a threat. But he keeps being like, "I just wanted to chat with you. It's really rude the way you're behaving." And he says, "I have some rather pointed questions for you all about Rasandis, about a certain armor spell, about the deaths of a sphinx, and about Clan Castus. I've got a few questions about your former teacher as well. I may be working with him now, but who knows how long that'll last." And they just decide, "Oh, all right. So when you said I just wanted to chat, you were basically going to ask a bunch of questions you knew we weren't going to answer." And they decide to get back into the fight anyway. But this dude can teleport, so absolutely nothing they do hits. And Hugh is like, "Well, I can do something to stop him from teleporting. To stop him from teleporting us. But I can't stop him from teleporting himself." And even though it's just, whether it affects them, that's still kind of impressive. And Matin Koss is like, "Really? That's pretty good, like somebody your age." So there is a boulder heading towards them. Darkness opens and it disappears. And here comes Eudaxis Scalesworn. And I love Talia. "It's my favorite evil storybook vizier." "I'm not evil, nor from a storybook, nor a vizier, Talia. I am a high priest, thank you." "Well, it's good to see you regardless." "Run along on your mission, children. I'll take care of this repugnant criminal." "Take care of me, will you, old man?" And they get into a teleporter fight, and I love Sabe having to be like, "Talia, look, I get it. I know this is boss as hell. We cannot stay. We have to go, girl." But then we get chapter 46, teleporter fight, ! In which the author of the book was like, "Don't worry, I got you, fam. I know you want to see this shit, so we are going to do it." And we get to be in Eudaxis' head again, which I actually am excited about, because I remembered liking Eudaxus when we were in his head before. He wasn't right about everything, but he had like a good mental process about him, and he seemed very competent despite being wrong about things and getting tricked. It was the kind of thing that felt like it wasn't unreasonable that you fell for it. You weren't being an asshole, or what's the word I want? You were still doing your due diligence. It wasn't neglect, So I like being in his head, and I was enjoying very much getting to see like just how deep, bone deep his devotion to Indris is. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. When he had first learned of his affinity and learned he was a shadow mage, he dreamed of becoming a covert agent for his queen, of engaging in spycraft and sabotage. When he had first seen his queen close as a young man, training to join his queen's forces, he had for the first time felt the call to join her cult, to serve however best glorified his queen rather than himself. And the last dream stuck. Eudaxus dedicated himself to Indris's glory, Indris's fame, and over the years, his dedicated service ushered him up through the ranks until he became her youngest ever high priest, still in his late 30s. And he'd held that position for decades, for more than half his life so far. Throughout all of those dreams, both lived and unlived, Eudaxus had known one truth. He would be honored to die for his queen someday. And it looked like today might just be that day. And spoilers, it's not, but ultimately it still could be. It just doesn't seem to be this particular fight. So he is going toe-to-toe with Matin Koss, who is very, very dangerous. And like, he freely is saying here that he has never gone up against somebody who is as dangerous as this guy. The gangster Prince Great Power could teleport faster, farther, and more frequently than the shadow and spatial mages Eudaxus had fought before, and could shift multiple tons of material with a single spell. Teleporters were rare, and having the capability ranked one automatically as an archmage, but it was far rarer for one to stand among the great powers. Matin Koss absolutely stood among at least the lesser ranks of the great powers. Eudaxus absolutely did not, and yet Eudaxus refused to back down. He dodged back and forth from an obvious feint, and as the gangster flickered behind him, he found that Eudaxus had already sunk to his waist in his own shadow. You guys, when I first heard that in the audiobook, and he says sunk to his waist in his own Addo was not what I was expecting the next, part of that word to be. And I don't know why it wasn't, because I already know what he can do, but it just felt like we were going a different way. I had a moment. So Eudaxus manages him for a bit, but then he kind of stumbles. Koss gains the upper hand. They didn't stay long enough to witness the seeds deposited in the elder's deep footprints grow into mighty trees, banyans, and baobabs that tore apart the Lich's demesne. Didn't stay long enough to witness the fall of the Lich, witness its fully functional avatar seize and convulse as the rising trees tore up the already ravaged physical substrate of its mind. And I just felt so bad. These Liches, I don't really know if they were like good people, but I feel like they have just been leveled in a way that seems disrespectful. They were such a big deal and such a key factor in Havath's power. And the way that they have each been cast aside dead is it's a letdown, but I don't mean that in terms of like a criticism of the writing. It's just a letdown in how much power one can hold and how abruptly that just ceases to matter. Do you get what I mean? They raced across labyrinth corridors faster than any but a Thunderbringer, dueled above rampaging herds of labyrinth monsters, slowly dying in the cold of Ithos, and Eudaxus marveled at the strangeness of the creatures. They found themselves on a great labyrinth platform with some sort of immense chamber inside, and the two of them pulled out magics beside their teleportation. Eudaxus and Kos tried to warp the very properties of space, Eudaxus trying to stab Kos with spears of shadow, Kos aggressively dispelling his efforts by altering distance itself. Eudaxus almost had the spatial mage when he sent his voice through the shadows as a distraction, but almost wasn't good enough. Kos tried to rebut by teleporting hundreds of tons of rubble above Eudaxus's head, but Eudaxus was easily able to shadow step out of the way. The battle had gone longer than Eudaxus had expected, longer than his mana reservoir should ever have been able to maintain. Most such battles between teleporters were over in seconds, a minute or two at most. But the mana-rich air of Havath City, the unnatural density of its ether after the labyrinth's rupture, let their duel just keep going and going. And there is a moment here that I found so chilling, talking about how I am not somebody who could just obey orders. Eudaxus could remember the first man he'd killed for his queen. Not the man's name, but his face, as his brimstone magic died, as he slumped down on the spear of shadow Eudaxus had impaled him on. He couldn't remember why the man had deserved death. Had he been a thief? An assassin? Had he ever known? Had he ever asked? I could never kill him. All right, yeah. Doing it. What? No. Oh my God. Eudaxus. This, this devotion, I don't understand it. I just don't. And maybe if I met Indris, I would get it. Maybe if I met Indris, I would feel like such an insignificant flea on the face of the planet that I would be like, no. Worshipping her makes sense. But as from where I'm sitting right now, I'm just like, what? So there's a mention of them getting lured into the bamboo great power and getting out of that. And it's funny because we don't see it. We just hear about it, which just gives you an idea of how long the battle's going on, that something like that, it would just take too long to describe. Their duel took them into a warehouse filled with cowering Havathi deserters. And when it took them back out, none of the Havathi soldiers were left alive. There is something so sad about that, you guys. These people just went to a warehouse to kind of wait things out. These two bust in, slaughter all of them either on purpose or by accident as just a side effect of what it is they're doing. Doesn't even merit a mention whether or not it was on purpose, because it's just so irrelevant. And then they found themselves in the last place they wanted to be, not because they had transported themselves there, but because that place had overtaken them. And we get some mention here about the way you think about space if you can teleport. You would think about place not merely as a geographic location, but as an intersecting series of definitions, an overlapping and interlocking series of categories. There were the simple geographic places, then there were magical places, desert oases hidden by attention wards, caves where spatial mages had warped distance to be longer in than out, or worse, longer out than in. Extraplanar spaces that had begun degrading over time, that opened themselves up in spasms and flickers. There were spaces defined by crowds that stopped being places when the crowd dispersed, the line they'd waited in or the entertainers they'd watched gone. There were the places that followed crowds across a city, angry mobs, parade goers. There were the places that only existed at certain times of day when the sun cast the shadow just right across the street, making it feel strange and mysterious. There were places that existed only in certain seasons, or even just once a year. Places that were physically temporary, dunes that would shift over time, wastelands of coastal debris that would vanish and be reborn with every changing of the tides. Places that required you to be in a specific emotional state to understand, or that forced you into that emotional state. Places that were defined by the people that had once been there, the battlegrounds of dead powers, the corpses of liches. Some teleporters ignored the study of spaces like this. None of the doubters ever joined the great ranks of teleporters. The place that had overtaken Eudaxus and Matt and Kos was a moving place, a place that destroyed other places, a place defined by an event. It was the place where Indris and her allies battled the monster that had once been the Sunworm. It was the place that was riven by fire, lightning, and sand. So they get separated, and they're both trying to, like, move out of there, but it's such fucking chaos in there that they can't seem to find a way out. As the four immense flyers dodged around labyrinth columns, Eudaxus realized with dread the monster was winning. Even as he watched in dread, Heliothrax drew up a vast cloud of toxic gases, evaporating from the exposed pipelines of the intertwined demesne. And then the place defined by destruction and battle had passed, revealing a brand new place, a place scoured by their wrath, leaving only the battered but intact emergent labyrinth. And then a hand was wrapped around Eudaxus' throat from behind. And it's Matankos who can't help but gloat before he kills him, which is what fucks him up. Because Eudaxus, he grasps his wrist, and this guy goes flying. And he looks up and is just like, what the fuck just happened? And Eudaxus is standing over him, and the front of his robes is cut open. High Priest Eudaxus was absolutely ripped. Muscles bulged in places they had no business bulging, even on a young man, let alone someone closer to 80 than 70. And this made me think of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And what was his name? Bobo. You guys know who I'm talking about. The king who was friends with him when he was a kid. And how he's like, you know, fighting him and looks like this bent old man, but then he takes his shirt off and he's like a fucking... And, you know, he is quite old and probably mad, but also he can handle himself. And I love this. Eudaxus can't, like... He's just going, oh, wow, I finally caught you. Like, he can't help but sort of mock this guy for what he did. And he just strangles this guy to death. And that is the end of that. Boomy, thank you, MX Shard. Yes, that was who I thought of here. And I love it. I love it whenever there is a joke about somebody that you wouldn't think as being ripped, turning out to be ripped. In The Simpsons, of course, there's Flanders, but the one that I really enjoy is Willie being super ripped and like just fine as hell, even though the man is not okay otherwise. Eudaxus had always dreamed of dying honorably in the service of his queen. Today might still be the day, even if this hour was not the hour. Eudaxus smiled grimly and sank back into the shadows without fear. And that is the end of the chapter. So, yeah, I really enjoyed being with Eudaxus, and that fight was really, really fun. Teleportation has long been one of the powers that I have said I would want if I got one, because it's just so convenient. I just always think about, you know, you're on your way somewhere and you realize you forgot something, or you are, like, needing to be somewhere and your transportation falls through, or you're just, like, overstressed and you need to go somewhere beautiful to just have a moment briefly, you know. It's that sort of thing that always attracts me, but seeing how it can be used in a battle is really fascinating. All right, so I have to wrap this up, but thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. This is really fun. And MX Shard says, I don't get great power cults. That's a person. That's Jake, who's super good at throwing fire around. Right? I get what, like, that's exactly what I have toughness with. Like, everybody ultimately is just a person. So worshiping in a way that feels like you're pretending they're more, even if they actually have more power than the average person, that's so circumstantial. It's not because they are inherently worthy of it. And that's the part I think that it doesn't make sense to me, but that is a reality of how some people move through the world, you know, so I don't know. But anyway, all right, I gotta wrap. Thank you guys again, and I will be seeing you again soon with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
Unspoiled Network podcast.